The bells of St. Catherine's Church echoed across London as guests whispered in confusion. Lady Charlotte Whitmore stood frozen at the altar, her hands trembling around her bouquet. Everyone was waiting for the groom. But he never came. Minutes turned into an hour. Then a messenger arrived carrying a letter. Charlotte's father snatched it open. His face turned crimson with humiliation. "That coward," he shouted. Charlotte's heart sank. "What is it, father?" The Earl crushed the letter in his hand. "Lord Harrington has eloped with another woman." Gasps filled the church. Society ladies exchanged scandalized whispers. Charlotte stood motionless. 3 years. 3 years she had spent preparing for this marriage. 3 years believing she was loved. And now she had been abandoned in front of everyone. Tears filled her eyes. Humiliation burned through her soul. Without another word, she lifted her skirts and ran. Ignoring the shocked cries behind her, she escaped through the side doors of the church. That evening, while London buzzed with gossip, Charlotte made a decision. She would disappear. Far away from the pitying stares. Far away from the cruel whispers. Far away from the memories. By dawn, she had packed only a few belongings and boarded a carriage heading north to the countryside. Nobody knew where she was going. Nobody. Except one man. Duke Sebastian Ashford. Tall, powerful, and feared throughout England, Sebastian was known as the Ice Duke. He rarely attended social gatherings and cared little for London's scandals. Yet he had witnessed Charlotte's humiliation. And strangely, he couldn't forget the pain he had seen in her eyes. When he learned that she had vanished, unease settled over him. "Find her," he ordered his secretary. "Your Grace?" the man asked in surprise. Sebastian's expression remained calm. Discreetly. Days later, his men returned with news. Lady Charlotte had rented a small cottage in the village of Rosewood. Alone. Without servants. Without companions. Sebastian frowned. A noblewoman raised among luxury had no business living by herself in the middle of nowhere. But why should he care? He asked himself that question repeatedly. And each time he found no answer. 3 days later, he was riding toward Rosewood himself. Meanwhile, Charlotte had discovered that life in the countryside was very different. She burned meals, nearly flooded the kitchen, and accidentally chased chickens into her neighbor's pond. Still, for the first time in years, she felt free. No balls. No gossip. No expectations. Just peace. One afternoon, while trying to carry a basket of apples from the market, she stumbled. The basket fell. Apples rolled everywhere. Before she could gather them, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Allow me." Charlotte froze. Slowly she turned around. Her eyes widened. Standing there, dressed in a dark riding coat, was Duke Sebastian Ashford. She stared in disbelief. "Your Grace." Sebastian picked up an apple and placed it back in the basket. "You should be more careful." Charlotte blinked. "What are you doing here?" The Duke's lips curved slightly. "I might ask you the same question." Her cheeks flushed. "You followed me?" "Yes." Charlotte nearly dropped the basket again. "You followed me?" "I did." "Why?" For the first time in years, the powerful Duke of Ashford seemed uncertain. And before he could answer, a frightened little boy ran through the market square. "They've fallen into the river." Everyone gasped. "Who?" Charlotte cried. "My sisters." Without hesitation, Charlotte threw down the basket and ran toward the river. Sebastian followed. When they reached the bridge, both froze. 2 young girls were struggling in the freezing water below, and the current was carrying them away. Without thinking, Charlotte jumped. "Lady Charlotte!" Sebastian shouted. But she had already disappeared beneath the water. And a second later, the Duke jumped after her. Without a second thought, Duke Sebastian Ashford dove into the freezing river after Charlotte. The villagers screamed in horror. The current was strong and the 2 little girls had already drifted several feet downstream. Charlotte managed to grab the younger child, but the icy water pulled her under before she could reach the second girl. "Charlotte!" Sebastian shouted. Ignoring the danger, he swam toward the older girl and seized her just as she disappeared beneath the surface. By the time the villagers pulled them ashore, everyone was trembling from the cold. Thankfully, both children survived. Charlotte coughed violently as Mrs. Parker, the baker's wife, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "You foolish girl," the woman cried through tears. "You could have died." Charlotte smiled weakly. "But the girls are safe." Nearby, Sebastian stood soaked from head to toe, his expression darker than a storm. For several moments, he simply stared at Charlotte. Then, to everyone's surprise, he snapped. "What were you thinking?" Charlotte blinked. They were drowning. And so were you. His voice echoed across the riverbank. You jumped without thinking. The villagers exchanged nervous glances. Nobody had ever seen the Duke raise his voice. Charlotte stared at him in shock. I couldn't just stand there. And you expect me to stand there while you throw your life away? The words escaped before Sebastian realized what he had said. Silence fell. Charlotte's cheeks turned pink. Sebastian cleared his throat. Take her home, he ordered quietly. That evening Mrs. Parker insisted that both Charlotte and the Duke stay at her inn until they recovered. The storm outside made traveling impossible. Charlotte sat beside the fireplace wrapped in blankets. Across the room, Sebastian silently read a newspaper. Neither spoke. Until Charlotte finally asked, "Why did you really come here?" Sebastian lowered the paper. "You know why?" "No," he sighed. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you." Charlotte looked down. "You pitied me?" "No. Everyone in London pitied me. Not me." "Then why?" For a moment the Duke remained silent. Then he answered honestly. "Because when I saw you standing alone at that altar." His voice softened. "I wanted to kill Harrington." Charlotte burst out laughing. To Sebastian's astonishment, he found himself smiling. It was the first genuine smile he had worn in years. Over the following weeks, Sebastian remained in Rosewood. Officially, he claimed he was inspecting nearby lands. Unofficially, everyone in the village knew better. The children adored him. Mrs. Parker treated him like a son. And Charlotte found herself enjoying his company more and more. She discovered that behind his cold reputation was a man who secretly fed stray cats. A man who remembered everyone's birthdays. A man who donated anonymously to orphanages. A man who laughed far more than society believed. One sunny afternoon, Charlotte found him repairing a broken fence. She stared. A Duke fixing fences? Sebastian shrugged. It was annoying me. She laughed. You are very strange. And yet you're still here. Her smile faded slightly. Not everyone stays. Sebastian looked at her seriously. I do. Those 3 simple words touched her heart more deeply than she cared to admit. But peace rarely lasted forever. One morning an elegant carriage arrived in Rosewood. Charlotte's smile vanished instantly. Lord Harrington had returned. The very man who had abandoned her. He stepped out with an arrogant smile. My dear Charlotte. Sebastian's eyes narrowed dangerously. Charlotte stood frozen. What are you doing here? Harrington smiled. I've come to correct a mistake. Sebastian folded his arms. What mistake? Harrington glanced at him dismissively. I wasn't speaking to you. Then he turned back to Charlotte. The woman I ran away with left me penniless. Charlotte stared at him in disbelief. So I've realized you are the woman I should have married. Even Sebastian seemed stunned by the audacity. Harrington dropped to one knee. Charlotte, forgive me? Marry me? The entire village square fell silent. Mrs. Parker nearly fainted. Children stopped playing. Aunt Charlotte could hardly believe what she was hearing. But before she could answer, another voice interrupted. No. Everyone turned. It was Sebastian. His face was calm. Too calm. Which frightened people far more. Harrington frowned. This is none of your concern. Sebastian stepped forward. Oh, I believe it is. Charlotte's heart began racing. Because she had never seen the Duke look so furious. And then, to everyone's astonishment, Sebastian Ashford looked directly at Lord Harrington and declared, She cannot marry you. Because I intend to ask Lady Charlotte to become my Duchess. Crown left at the altar, she fled to the countryside. The Duke followed her in Part 3 Final. A stunned silence fell over the village square. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Lord Harrington rose slowly from one knee, his face pale with disbelief. What did you just say? He demanded. Duke Sebastian Ashford didn't take his eyes off Charlotte. I said Lady Charlotte will not marry you. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Because I intend to ask her to become my Duchess. Gasps erupted all around. Mrs. Parker nearly dropped her basket. The village children stared wide-eyed. Aunt Charlotte herself looked completely speechless. Harrington let out an incredulous laugh. This is absurd. Sebastian finally turned toward him. No, Lord Harrington. What is absurd is abandoning a woman at the altar and returning only when your fortune has disappeared. Several villagers nodded in agreement. Harrington's face darkened. You know nothing about our relationship. I know enough. Sebastian stepped closer. You humiliated her before all of London. You broke her heart. And now you believe she should be grateful for your return? The former fiancé opened his mouth, but no words came. Charlotte had never seen anyone defend her like this. For years she had tried to please others. She had endured gossip, expectations, and humiliation. But Sebastian simply stood beside her. Without asking for anything in return. Lord Harrington turned desperately toward her. Charlotte, surely you don't believe this nonsense. She looked at him quietly. Then she smiled. But it wasn't the smile he remembered. It was stronger, happier, and completely free. No, Edward. His eyes widened. No. Charlotte shook her head. The woman you left at the altar would have forgiven you. But she no longer exists. She took a deep breath. You didn't lose me when you ran away. You lost me when you thought I would always wait for you. For the first time in his life, Lord Harrington looked defeated. Without another word, he climbed back into his carriage and left Rosewood forever. As the carriage disappeared, the entire square erupted in applause. Mrs. Parker wiped tears from her eyes. Good riddance, she shouted. Everyone laughed. But Charlotte turned to Sebastian. You shouldn't have done that. His expression changed immediately. I know. And I apologize. She blinked. What? Sebastian sighed. I spoke without thinking. You were under no obligation to accept. If my actions embarrassed you, Before he could finish, Charlotte burst out laughing. The Duke looked completely confused. You apologize too much, Your Grace? I do not. You absolutely do. For the first time in years, Sebastian actually blushed. And Charlotte found it adorable. Over the next several weeks, life in Rosewood returned to normal. Sebastian remained by her side. Not because he expected an answer. Not because he wished to pressure her. But simply because he loved being with her. Together they planted flowers. Visited the market. Read books by the fire. And laughed more than either had thought possible. One evening, as the sun painted the sky gold and pink, Sebastian led Charlotte to a hill overlooking the village. To her surprise, dozens of lanterns hung from the trees. The entire hillside glowed like a dream. Charlotte covered her mouth. Sebastian. He smiled nervously. And that alone made her heart melt. Because the feared Duke of Ashford looked absolutely terrified. I had prepared a speech, he confessed. But I've forgotten every word. Charlotte laughed softly. That's unfortunate. He chuckled. Indeed. Then he took her hands. Charlotte Whitmore. When I followed you to the countryside, I thought I was rescuing a broken heart. But I was wrong. His eyes softened. You rescued mine. Tears filled her eyes. For years I lived only out of duty. Until you taught me how to live again. He knelt before her. And opened a small velvet box. Inside was the most beautiful ring she had ever seen. My dear Charlotte. Will you do me the greatest honor of becoming my wife? Through happy tears she whispered. Yes. His shoulders sagged with relief. Thank heaven. She laughed. Were you worried? Terrified? Sebastian Ashford afraid? Only of losing you. 6 months later, England witnessed one of the happiest weddings in recent memory. But this time, there were no whispers, no humiliation, and no abandoned bride. As Charlotte walked down the aisle, she saw only one man waiting for her. And unlike the last time, he looked at her as though she were the greatest treasure in the world. When the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, Sebastian kissed her hand and whispered, I would have followed you anywhere. Charlotte smiled through tears. And you did. Years later, people still spoke of the Duke who had chased a runaway lady to the countryside. But those who truly knew the story understood something far more beautiful. She hadn't been abandoned at the altar. She had simply been walking away from the wrong man. And toward the one heaven had intended for her all along. The end.